Number 1.
After almost 114 years, the mystery of the death of Hazel Drew, the 20-year-old girl whose case inspired the story of Laura Palmer, played by actress Sherilyn Fenn, at the center of the cult masterpiece Twin Peaks, may finally have found a solution. By David Lynch and Mark Frost. The mystery of Hazel Drew dates back to July 7, 1908, when a group of boys who were camping in Teals Pond, a small town on the shores of Sand Lake, in New York State, saw the body of a young woman emerge from the waters of the lake. Hazel Drew, in fact. A death that shook the quiet local community, and that was quickly filed as a suicide, despite the many obscure points left by the investigation conducted by the investigators of the time, from which came out, just like in Twin Peaks, not a few disturbing details about the quiet provincial life which was not peaceful at all. A new book by two authors and fans of the Lynch series, David Bushman and Mark Givens, just released in the US under the title Murder at Teals Pond, is dedicated to the story of Hazel Drew. By analyzing documents and newspaper articles of the time, Bushman and Givens managed to reconstruct not only Hazel Drew's secret life, but also to formulate a precise hypothesis about her end. It was undoubtedly a murder. The two authors found how the young woman, who had worked since the age of 14 as a waitress and housekeeper, had forged ties with the families of the most influential notables of the small community of Teals Pond, a stronghold of the Republican Party. And, working in their homes, she would have come into contact with a cauldron of crime, sex, and corruption. In this very reality she might have perhaps felt something that she shouldn't ever have made more intimate bonds than legitimate with some big shot, the which, if known, could have caused scandal. So someone might have gotten it out of the way. And the authors of the book also mention two specific names, those of the embalmer at the local funeral home, a certain William Cushing, and of a friend of his, a leading figure in the local Republican Party, Fred Schatzel. To frame them, the testimony of a couple, William and Elizabeth Hoffey, who told police investigators investigating Drew's death that they saw, one of the nights preceding the discovery of the body, in the lake area, a suspicious wagon with on board two men carrying something strange, and who, meeting the couple, immediately turned around so as not to be recognized. The detectives knew that Cushing had borrowed the wagon from Schatzel that night, but they never investigated the clue or bothered to ask the Hoffeys to recognize the two suspects by photo or live. Just Cushing and Schatzel would be, for the authors of the book, the real killers. And they would act to protect themselves or some Republican Party notable from a scandal by getting rid of poor Hazel who knew too much. All this, Bushman and Givens venture, with the protection of the police, who did not want to go through with it. A disturbing story, full of question marks, set against the backdrop of the quiet and disturbing American province. The same one that, at the end of the 80s, fascinated David Lynch and his friend and screenwriter Mark Forst, to the point of choosing to adapt it to make it one of the absolute masterpieces of the thriller genre.
Number 2.
On the 15th of July 1982, a maintenance worker came across her body at the southeast corner of Cedar Ridge Cemetery in Blairstown, New Jersey. She was discovered lying on her stomach, and as she was turned over, officers saw that someone had viciously beaten her face beyond recognition, and her skull had been destroyed. Forensics determined that the young woman had been lying there, undiscovered, for 3 weeks. The young girl was thought to be between 14 and 18 years old, white and around 5 feet 2 inches in height. She wore a peasant skirt with peacocks on it and a red shirt, but no shoes or underwear were found. She had a gold cross around her neck and red polish on her fingernails. There was no trace of drugs in her system, and she had no surgical scars, tattoos or birthmarks on her body. She had trauma to her hands and arms from attempting to fight her attacker or defend herself. Despite taking her fingerprints and dental records, there was no match made to the girl, and with no leads, her case went cold. In 1985, a press conference was held in the basement of Warren County Courthouse, where officials stated that there were multiple physical similarities between Princess Doe and another missing girl, 13-year-old Diane Dye, who disappeared in 1979 from San Jose. However, not everyone agreed. The lead investigator on Princess's case, Lieutenant Eric Kranz, didn't believe that the two girls were the same and Diane's family reciprocated his feelings. In 2013, the police eventually compared DNA samples from Princess Doe and Diane's mother, but the results concluded that they were not the same girl. In 1999, Donna and Arthur Kinlaw were arrested in California for attempting to commit welfare fraud. However, in Donna's interview, she began to tell police about the murders of multiple women. They'd met Linda at a reggae bar in Bay Shore in April 1984. She told police that they'd lured her away from the bar, where Arthur hit Linda in the head with a baseball bat. She'd refused to join the sex worker ring he ran in Hunts Point, New York, so he killed her. Linda's body was dumped in the East River, near the Nick Department of Sanitation, and she washed up a few weeks later. Her identity still remains unknown. Donna then told police about the tenant who lived in their house that Arthur had beaten to death in 1983. The woman was disabled and relied on crutches to move around. Arthur buried her in the yard of their home and poured cement over her grave. Police dug up her body in December 2000, but once again, her identity remains unknown. Donna moved on to Christina Cosma, a woman who had joined Arthur's sex ring to pay for her drug habit. She'd been shot to death by Arthur and discarded in Coram in a wooded area because she didn't want to work for him anymore. She then told police that Arthur had brought home a teenage girl in July 1982. She said that the pair had left together, and Arthur returned home later that night without the girl, changed out of his clothes, and dumped them after cleaning his car. She also claimed he'd admitted to Princess's murder. In an article from Newsday, Donna stated, "He told me if I didn't go to work, he would do to me what he did to the other girl. In the middle of the arguing, I said, 'Well, what did you do to the other girl?' He said, 'I'll take your life just like I took hers.'" Her statement was full of conjecture, and some of the details didn't add up when police spoke to Arthur about the crimes. He told a detective that Donna had actually witnessed him beating Princess to death in the cemetery. Arthur Kinlaw wasn't charged for Princess Doe's murder, despite claiming responsibility for her death. One of the reasons for a lack of conviction was because he and Donna were unable to name the teenager Arthur brought home with him. There was also no evidence he'd killed her. However, he was eventually sent to prison on 2 counts of second-degree murder. Donna pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received 3 to 10 years for Linda's murder. Linda also sat with a sketch artist to help build an image of the teenager they'd killed, but compared to the computer-generated image created by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, they were very different people. Lieutenant Eric Kranz was contacted by HBO, who was making a documentary named Missing. The documentary showed footage of finding Princess's body in the cemetery and detailed information about her case, but no leads came from the documentary. Season 1 of MTV's Fear showed a fictionalized version of Princess Doe's murder in 2000. She was portrayed as a sacrifice and that she'd been decapitated, blurring truth and entertainment. In 2012, Princess Doe was featured on America's Most Wanted to help generate interest in her case, and a reconstruction of her murder was also broadcast on CNN. Still, no valuable leads were received from either broadcast. The same year, The Untold Story of Princess Doe was authored by Christy Lee Napurano, which included theoretical musings of what happened to the teenager. Princess Doe was eventually buried in the same cemetery she was discovered 5 months after her death. Her headstone was bought with donations from locals and well-wishers. She was laid to rest without any arrests made for her murder, and although the case remains active, little has been done in recent years to help identify this young woman. Details of her case can be found on the Doe Network. Information tips can be called into the Warren County Prosecutor's Office, 1-900-8689-3922.
Number 3.
James Fulton, 90, believes that one day, he'll be able to take down his now famous billboards in Vidor and Rose City. He and Vidor Police Chief Rod Carroll hope a $50,000 reward for information that leads to the indictment of suspects in the murder of Kathy Page, the largest reward ever offered by Crime Stoppers of Southeast Texas, will make that happen. 34-year-old Kathy Page had recently split up from her husband, Steve, and their daughters were living with Kathy in the family home. On the night of her death, Kathy was heading out for some drinks and needed a babysitter. She called her estranged husband to ask if he could look after them while she went out with a girlfriend. In reality, she was going on a date and meeting the man at his hotel in Beaumont, a few miles away. Steve agreed and headed over to the house where Kathy was getting ready. She left around 11 p.m. in her car and headed to the hotel. The next morning at 5 a.m., Kathy's black Mercury Tracer was found in a ditch 100 yards from her home. Kathy was dead in the driver's seat, and the crash appeared to be an accident. However, when the police arrived, they agreed that something was very wrong with the crime scene. Kathy Page was not killed in her vehicle. She was killed at another location, cleaned up, redressed, and placed back in her vehicle, and after the vehicle had been rolled into the ditch. Detective Ray Mosley. The car was at an angle, nose first in the trench, yet Kathy was sat bolt upright in the seat with her head back against a headrest, despite not being strapped in by a seatbelt. The contents of her purse hadn't spilled, nor had the can of open soda, and the exterior of the car wasn't damaged. There was also grass on her clothing, despite Kathy being found fully inside of the car. Detective Ray Mosley walked up the road to Kathy's home and knocked on the door. Inside, Steve Page opened it to find the man he'd grown up with, telling him the news that his wife had been found dead. He became upset, wailing in despair. However, Mosley later recounted the story and said that Steve wasn't crying. He said, well, his wife was not home, and directly looked straight down the street towards where the car was. Steve seemed to be quite upset. He began to cry, and at times, threw himself on the couch crying. But yet, he would jump right back up, and we were talking, and there would be no signs of tears in his eyes. This seemed strange to me. Detective Ray Mosley. Kathy's autopsy showed that she'd been strangled, and her nose has been broken prior to her death. There was blood in her underwear, and later it was confirmed that she'd also been sexually assaulted by someone who did a vasectomy due to a lack of sperm in the semen. There was also blood found on the back of her neck and transferred blood on her clothes, which investigators agreed that she'd likely been killed elsewhere, reclothed and placed in her car. Kathy's date, known as Tom, volunteered his help in the investigation and passed a polygraph test, and he was never considered a suspect in Kathy's murder. He told investigators that she'd left his hotel room around 2:30 a.m. and had driven home. He said that she'd been wearing white jeans, a gray top, a watch, her wedding ring and earrings, and had a full face of makeup on. However, when Kathy was found, she was barefaced with no jewelry on her, and she was missing her socks. Kathy's sister, Sherry, would later state at trial that her bare face was indicative of Kathy's nightly routine of removing her makeup and jewelry and getting in the shower just before she went to bed. As is the case in most investigations, Steve wasn't questioned straight away, nor were his daughters. It wasn't until 2 days later that Steve was asked to go to the police station to answer questions. During his interview, he told police that he and Kathy had sex that night before she went out. Steve had a vasectomy a few months earlier, and it would explain why there was semen found inside her. Kathy and Steve met when she was 21 in Vidor. Steve was an insurance salesman who'd swept Kathy off her feet, despite a lot of interest from other young men at the time. The couple married in November 1981, and their oldest daughter was born soon after. Their second daughter was born 4 years later, but by 1991 their marriage was over, and Kathy had asked Steve for a friendly divorce. Steve had moved out just a few days before Kathy was murdered and was living in a condo nearby to be around for their children. He told investigators that they were working things out, but Kathy's sister told them that wasn't the case and Kathy had already moved on. Kathy had told Steve that she was meeting her friend Charlotte that night for drinks. Distrusting her story, Steve called Charlotte and she picked up the phone, despite Kathy asking her not to. Steve knew that his wife wasn't out with her friend, and underneath Charlotte's phone number was the number for the hotel in Beaumont, which he called. Steve was announced as the prime suspect in Kathy's murder later that day, but he claimed he was innocent. He said that he'd received phone calls from an unknown person, threatening him with the same fate as his wife. He claimed he tried to help in the investigation, but he was told he wasn't needed, and instead the police dragged his name through the mud. He later told the Daily Mail, "We don't have any evidence, it's not me, That's the police's response. They didn't help me one bit. They have smeared my name to hell and back. Despite the announcement that a suspect had been named, police never arrested Steve, and their lack of action angered Kathy's family. James Fulton was convinced the police were covering for Steve as he'd grown up members of the police force, and his parents were friendly with Detective Mosley's mother and father. He began painting signs to attract attention from people driving through Cedar, in the hope of pushing the police department into investigating his daughter's case further. The signed statements have included, "Steve Page brutally murdered his wife in 1991. Cedar PD does not want to solve this case. I believe they took a bribe. The Attorney General should investigate. James Fulton, her father." The sign includes images of Steve and Kathy. Steve eventually left Cedar for Houston in 1995, following the billboard creation. After Kathy was buried, the flowers left at her grave were found scattered across the cemetery on more than one occasion. James Fulton hired a private investigator who caught Steve Page on camera, kicking the flowers and marking her grave. The two families fought at each other, stating that the other was hiding information, and as the police wouldn't arrest Steve, James Fulton instead took him to civil court for the wrongful death of Kathy and to stop Steve from collecting her life insurance payments. During the trial, the video of Steve kicking the flowers at Kathy's grave was screened, and other accounts came to light. According to Dorothy Fulton, Kathy's mother, she'd arrived at Kathy's home an hour after her daughter's body was found. Steve had a scratch on his nose and was pacing the living room, wiping his hands. Despite the early hour, he'd also been doing laundry, and there was a fresh wash hanging up around the house. Dorothy and James had also visited the house 4 days after Kathy's death, where they witnessed Steve and some of his family members trying to clean the carpet in the living room. She said they were working on one spot on the carpet, and according to her testimony, that was the moment her husband realized that Steve had killed his daughter. Because it took 3 years to get the district attorney to sign off on a warrant to search Kathy's home, any evidence that could have been in the house would have been long gone, so the trial was mostly made up of witness accounts. Steve had also told police that all of Kathy's watches were missing, but later found all except the one she'd been wearing the night she died. He also denied calling Kathy's friend, Charlotte, the night of her death, but had already told others he had spoken to her. Steve was found financially liable for his wife's death and was ordered to pay $200,000 to the Fultons. Later, he was also found guilty of repeatedly vandalizing her grave. Whether Steve Page killed his wife or not, the police investigation was flawed from the start. When the car was found, the usual steps weren't taken to ensure that all evidence was preserved, including photographs. Evidence was lost by police not cordoning off the crime scene, and there was no film in the police's camera, so there were never any photographs taken of the scene. Any evidence from Kathy's home that may have led police to the killer would have disappeared by the time the warrant was issued, 3 years later. Steve Page went on to become a carpenter and remarried. According to the Daily Mail, he now has a very young girlfriend. He sent his daughters to live with his parents in Alabama after the death of their mother. The blog, a billboard in Texas, is run by daughter, Erin. She wrote about the relationships she had with her father and grandfather and about updates to the investigation that has stalled since its reopening in 2018. Kathy's youngest daughter, Monica, died several years ago and is remembered on the blog by her sister. The reward for information about Kathy's death was increased to $6,000, but the case still remains unsolved. The family continued to remind the residents of Cedar about Kathy and take adverts out in the local paper on her birthday. James Fulton has spent more than $200,000 on the billboards that continue to sit next to Interstate 10, and he said in 2018 that he had no plans to remove them. "I've had the signs there by the freeway ever since I started putting them up, and they'll stay there until I die. We can't go to the Cedar police because they're not going to do nothing. I know they're not going to do nothing. Everybody's saying, to solve this case, it has to be the Texas Rangers, have someone from outside coming in and taking over. The case is still open, and tips can be called into Crime Stoppers 1-800-252-TIPS, 8477.
Number 4.
Maureen Brubaker Farley's murderer has been identified after 50 years of hiding in plain sight. The autumn season hadn't yet hit Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and teenagers Kevin Coppice and Danny Lineweaver had one thing on their minds: they wanted to hunt. They'd taken their guns down to the woods and come across a woman asleep on top of a car in the ravine just off Eli Road. They didn't want to disturb her, so they slung their rifles over their shoulders and continued on their way, not giving the sleeping woman another thought. However, later that day, they headed back the way they came, not realizing what they were about to discover. The sleeping lady hadn't moved in the hours they'd been gone, and the two boys decided to take a closer look. The color of the woman's skin likely gave away her condition, and the boys ran home, returning later, dragging Danny's mother back to the car. Maureen Brubaker Farley was a vivacious 17-year-old, originally from Sioux City, Iowa. The oldest of 7, Maureen would often look after her siblings while her parents went out in the evenings. Promises of monetary gain meant the children liked their sister looking after them, and they were devastated when Maureen announced she was moving to Cedar Rapids, over 4 hours away. She was born on July 4th. Everybody said she'd be a firecracker. She was. She was a wild child out of all of our 7 kids, Maureen's mother, Ann Brubaker, said. At 15 years old, Maureen had married David Farley and moved to California. More recently, however, David was serving a prison sentence in Anamosa State Penitentiary. Maureen had decided to move closer to her new husband and set up residency in a rented room just outside the main streets. Maureen also got a job as a waitress at Ouida's restaurant in the town to pay rent and fuel money to visit David. When Maureen didn't turn up to her shift at the diner on the 20th of September, her manager called the police. The young woman was dependable, and it wasn't like her to miss work. 4 days later, she was found by the boys. The missing person report and the unidentified body soon took on a single investigation, with detectives quickly realizing they were one and the same. Investigators initially believed that the teenager had been thrown out of a moving car, landing on the bonnet of the wreckage, but the autopsy gave an alternative answer. The examination showed a large skull fracture and possible rape. Maureen's clothes weren't torn, nor did she bear any defensive wounds, so it was unlikely that she'd seen her attacker coming. She also had clean feet, so had been wearing shoes that weren't found at the scene, and there was DNA left at the scene and on Maureen. It was still only 1971, so the sample was stored away. Maureen's handbag was also missing from the scene, along with its contents, and a plea was made in the Gazette to anyone who may have seen the young woman in the days before she was found. Small details were revealed in the press soon after, and Police Chief Kenneth Vanus claimed multiple pairs of shoes were missing from Maureen's apartment. Her car was also still at the building with a full tank of gas, and a pack of cigarettes she'd bought on the 17th of September were in her room, partially smoked. Years of investigation ensued, with suspects given polygraph tests and hours of questioning by the desperate police force. Still, no one was ever charged with Maureen's murder, and the case eventually went cold. Over the years, the case was re-examined, and Maureen's family never gave up hope. Her grown-up siblings and their mother still advocated for justice for their Maureen and were always on hand to help the police with their inquiries. In 2006, the DNA sample taken from Maureen was developed into a complete profile, but no matches were found on the database. In 2010, the Brubaker family offered $5,000 for any information leading to an arrest in the case, but no one ever came forward. However, 5 years later, the investigation finally got a new lease of life when lead detective Matt Denlinger was assigned the cold case. We kind of started all over from scratch in 2015. This was a new case with us, so we had to familiarize ourselves with all of the details of the case and make a plan going forward, said Denlinger. The detectives on the case began to go through the 16 suspects and started to eliminate them until they were left with just one. Under warrant, a DNA sample was taken from the suspect's daughter, and a match was confirmed. George Merlin Smith was a local who frequented the diner where Maureen worked and was reportedly a friend. He'd inserted himself into the investigation, asking police on multiple occasions how the case was progressing. The 53-year-old had been questioned at the time, but had refused to partake in a polygraph test, and he was never charged. As I dove into it a little more, I realized that in 1971, they had really honed in sick on it a little bit on George, being one of the suspects. Some of his behavior at the police department and his suspiciously inquiring about the status of this case. Those are things that led them to suspect that he might be a good candidate for this, lead detective Matt Denlinger told KWWL. According to reports, Smith worked at a haulage company and at the liquor store next to the building where Maureen lived. Unfortunately, in 2013, Smith died at the age of 94 years old, so no one will be charged with Maureen's murder, and the case will now be closed. 50 years after Maureen's death, her family can now have some closure to the mystery that's overshadowed them for so long. Maureen's sibling took to the Facebook page created solely to remember her sister, to thank everyone involved in the case. We realize that nothing can bring Maureen back, and justice in this world may not seem like justice at all, but maybe now we can find some kind of peace. Whenever a family member would pass from this world, my mom said, well, now they are up there with Maureen and they are all together, and they know the answers, and how happy they must be to see each other again. God bless my mother, strongest woman I have ever known.